Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. I'm here today to talk to you about Bruges la Morte, which is a novel by Georges Rodenbach. This is a novel that not many people have heard of, but if you have heard about it, it was probably in relation to Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, which you can see right here. What's the connection here? There are many similarities between the novel and the film. And the film Vertigo is actually based on another novel. It's a novel titled D'entre les morts by Boileau and Narcejac. Those are two authors right there. At the most basic level, you have a very similar plot or a very similar situation. A widower meets a woman who looks very much like his deceased wife. And why did this happen, right? One of the questions is why the resemblances between these two. It is believed that Boileau and Narcejac were inspired, let's be nice, by Rodenbach's novel Bruges la Morte. So that is why you have those similarities between the two things, the novel and the film. Now, I did not find out about Bruges la Morte through Vertigo. The fact is that there is an Argentine movie titled Más allá del olvido, Beyond Oblivion. It has been called many times one of the best Argentine films ever made, and that is how I heard about it. There is also an opera by Erich Wolfgang Korngold from 1920 that is also based on the novel Bruges la Morte. So you can see there are many connections here, even though this is a novel that not many people have read and that not many people have actually even heard of. It was published in 1892. Okay, let's go with a little bit of background here. It is considered to be an example of the symbolist novel. Like what else? I guess like the novels of J.K. Huysmans, like Arlebourg, like Là-Bas, all of those. And I'm not saying that Bruges la Morte is similar to any of those two novels, but it's a similar mode that we see at work in these texts, okay? It is also said to be the first novel to incorporate photographs into the text. Now, I would take that with a grain of salt. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to establish something like that, which was the first novel to actually do this. But in any case, if it's one of the early novels to take advantage of the image as part of the text. And in that sense, it would be a precursor to the works of W.G. Sebald, to Julio Cortázar, to Carlos Fuentes, to Mario Bellatin, and many others who did this, incorporated images into their novels. It was translated into English, Bruges la Morte. There's a translation from 1903 by Thomas Duncan. And I am sorry to say this, I would like to be very nice, but the fact is that the translation is just awful, okay? It's one of those translations where all of a sudden you look at the two texts, right? You compare them and you realize that there are words or sometimes entire passages missing from the translation. And at other points, you have stuff in the translation that's not there in the original. It's that kind of a thing. So not really a very good translation, I'm afraid. Now, Rodenbach was primarily a poet. Okay, keep that in mind. If you read this novel, you're gonna be able to tell because of the descriptions, because of the style. It's a very personal style, very, very. It's haunting. Okay, very well done, very well described. I would say the city, the characters, the inner states of the protagonist, and all that. And speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about the mode of the novel. Not really the genre, but the mode. There's a word in French, intimisme, and I'm going to say it in Spanish because my Spanish is a lot better than my French, intimismo, okay? This novel is an intimista novel. What do I mean by that? I wish we had this word in English, intimism, right? It's a novel that basically focuses on the inner state, in the inner world of the protagonist, the feelings, the emotions, the memories, okay, the obsessions. And it's basically a psychological novel. That's how you would call it in English. But I still wish we had the word intimist, because that really carries the point across. Before we go a little bit deeper into the material of the novel, I wanted to share with you a quote by Jorge Luis Borges. And you're thinking, Jorge Borges again? I mean, I'm Argentinian. I cannot I cannot avoid this, but it's a very good quote, and it really illustrates what's going on in Rodenbach's novel. This quote comes from Borges' little book of essays on Dante, on the Divine Comedy, so the Nueve Ensayos Dantescos from 1982. And what I'm going to read to you is just one sentence, right? But you can find it in the essay El Encuentro en un Sueño, The Encounter in a Dream, which basically looks at that moment of the Divine Comedy that we are all waiting for. You know what I mean? The part when Dante meets Beatrice, finally. So it's a very good essay. But what Borges says here is, and I'm going to read it to you in the original and then I'll translate it. Enamorarse es crear una religión cuyo Dios es falible. So to fall in love is to create a religion whose God is fallible. Okay? Keep that in mind, because that really is what's going on in Bruges la Morte. And the connection here between love and religion and also obsession, you know, is definitely present there. So what do we have here in Bruges la Morte? Let's look at characters and plot. Okay, we have a love triangle with a little bit of a twist. It's nothing new. It's something that's been done many, many times. But what happens here is that one of the points of that triangle is dead. Okay, one of the characters in the love triangle is not with us anymore. Okay, so there's a little bit of a problem there. We have Hugues Vian, the protagonist, then his deceased wife, who is unnamed, interestingly, and then the other point of the triangle would be Jane Scott, the woman that he meets that looks very much like his dead wife. This is a striking physical resemblance. Okay, really the key word here is physical. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's also another very important character here that is not part of the love triangle, and that is the maid. Barbe is her name, okay, and she is very, some people would say excessively or extremely, you know, religious. So after the death of his wife, Hugues decides to move to Bruges. He's been living there for 5 years when the novel begins, and this is a city that the novel describes as gray, okay, and it's also pervaded by a sense of religious ritual. Ritual is a very important element in this novel. Hugues is obsessed with the dead. Okay, his wife is dead, but it's almost as if she were still there. You know, the past is never dead, etc., etc. He keeps a lock of her hair as a memento, but this is described in the novel as a relic. Okay, so if when I say relic, you think of something religious, like a religious relic, that is exactly what's going on here. It's that kind of obsession. And we have a very important leitmotif in the novel, which is that of bells, the bells of the churches in Bruges. Now, these are not happy bells, okay? So, you know, think John Donne, you know, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Think Garcia Lorca. Okay, not really bells chiming here in a good sense. This is a very dark thing that's going on in this place and also inside the heart of this character. In terms of structure, we have 15 chapters of pretty, you know, equal or consistent length, I would say, and interspersed in the text we have these images of Bruges that the author decided to include, and I'm going to show you some of these because they're really nice and I think they do a lot. They really help with the understanding and the whole effect of the text. So we have towers, we have canals, we have streets, bridges, you know, sometimes the same image from different perspectives, so look out for that also. And virtually all the chapters in the novel focus on Hugues. Okay, so in the state of his mind, the state of his soul. So that's why I say it's an example of an intimista novel, a psychological novel, once again. Not much happens, really. Okay, the action is inner action. It really happens inside of the character, and it's quite drawn out, but it's not tedious. It's not boring at any point. So that is something that this novel does very well, to show you the inner world of a character without being, you know, boring or tedious. It's a very focused novel. Okay, that is one of the reasons why it doesn't really bore the reader. Most of the chapters deal with Hugues. Okay, and it's so focused that you could even turn the story into a short story or a novella. If you take away the element of development that the novel has, because you do not have really development in the novella, you have repetition. And there is a lot of repetition too in Bruges la Morte, but there's also a lot of development, and that's why it's a novel. And of course, it's not a short story either because of its length, but it could be either. You know, you can really change this novel into, or turn it into one of these other narrative genres. Now, there's one chapter that I think is slightly, seems slightly out of place to me. If we're going to look for flaws, as we say in Spanish, if we're going to look for the cat's fifth leg, this would be it, if you ask me. Chapter 8, okay? This one focuses on Barbe and her visit to a sister, or not really a sister, but in the sense of a nun. Okay, she's a nun, but I think she's a cousin of her. And it really, there is information about Hugues there. We do get that, but it doesn't seem to justify the shift in perspective. And that little narrative thread, the Barbe story and her visit to her relative, is taken up again in chapter 14, but chapter 14 gives us more information about Hugues also. So I don't know, chapter 8 doesn't really seem to work for me in the context of the rest of the novel. Let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to plot, okay? What do we have here? A man tries to bring the past back to life, which is what I call the Gatsby complex, because that's what Gatsby tries to do. And as you know, you cannot bring the past back to life. That is impossible. So you have a tragedy right there for sure. And also, there's a problem. The second woman that he meets is very similar to the first one, in her appearance, but her personality is completely different. You have maybe, a Virgin Mary figure in the first case and an Eve figure, if you want to look at some, Jungian archetypes here. Jane, the second woman, is a dancer. So that is already not considered respectable at this time. She is frivolous, she is just cold sometimes. And I would say at one point at least, she is even sadistic. So we have very different women here, and that is one of the reasons why what Hugues is trying to do is not gonna work. Now, very important thing here, Hugues does not marry Jane. Okay, he just gives her an apartment, just kind of installs her there. She even convinces her to leave the theater where she dances. So we have a kept woman, literally, in this case. And it's only during the climax of the novel that he invites her over to his house. Okay. Now, something that I found interesting in Bruges la Morte, the action, the inner action, the little bit of outer action that we have is interspersed with images of ritual, okay, of religious ritual. So we have this intertwining right there. And that also, there's a connection between those two during the climax. Okay, during the climax when we have this encounter at Hugues' house, there's a religious procession outside. So they can hear it, the two characters, they can see, they can look at it through the window. It's a great example of montage. But we do have that, intertwining of action and also religious ritual to accentuate or to emphasize the importance of that in this novel. Something that I found very interesting and very funny is that during the climax, I'm not going to reveal what happens, but at one point it says that Hugues feels vertigo. Okay, I thought that was, a joke in retrospect right there. I want to share some passages with you from the novel, okay? And I'm going to show you the French version, the original, and then the translations are by me. I want to, ask for your pardon. I want to apologize in advance for the pedestrian translations that I'm going to share with you, but believe me, they are a lot better than the ones in the translation from 1903. So, if you think this is bad, the others, I believe, are worse. So I hope you will forgive me. We have a preface in this novel in which Rodenbach explains that Bruges is a character in itself. Okay, he says, in this study of passion, we also and mainly wanted to evoke a city, the city as an essential character associated with states of mind, which advises, dissuades, determines to act. And later on he also says the city appears almost human. This is a very important point. That is why the city is in the title of the novel, actually. Then on page 2 I found a very short but very important phrase right here. We have Je suis le veuf. Okay, does that ring a bell? Of course it does, right? I Am the Widower. It's from Nerval's poem El Desdichado. Remember that classic sonnet by Nerval from the Chimeras from 1854, I want to say. That is something that I believe we are meant to connect this text with. I would actually read El Desdichado. It's a little sonnet, before reading Bruges la Morte, if you get the chance. Next, we have a passage in which we have this description. To tell the truth, he had no love for her. All he wanted was to be able to eternalize the lure of this mirage. So we know that Hugues does not really love Jane. We have a very sick character here. Okay, just like we have a very sick character in Vertigo. Not many people say that because Jimmy Stewart is such a nice guy and everything, but really it's a very dark obsession. It's really awful when you think about it in the details. Another place shows us the city coming to life. Okay, this is another passage. He walked consoled through its silence, as if Bruges too had risen from its tomb and presented itself as a new city that would resemble the old one. We have the connection here between the character and the city. At one point, the narrator says that if Jane resembles the previous woman, the dead wife, then Hugues comes to resemble more and more the city of Bruges itself. And let's keep in mind that it's a gray city, right? It's a city of ritual, of bells tolling all the time. And speaking of resemblance, this is a key term for this novel. This is a term that the novel explains and explores very much in depth. We have this: two contradictory desires of human nature, habit and novelty. Now, resemblance is precisely what reconciles them in us, makes them equal, joins them at an imprecise point. Resemblance is the skyline of habit and novelty. Mainly in love, this kind of refinement operates. Charm of a newly arrived woman who resembles the old. He had what one might call the sense of resemblance, an additional sense, frail and suffering, which tied things together by 1,000 ties, connected trees through gossamer, created an immaterial telegraphy between his soul and the inconsolable towers. So the idea of resemblance, once again, this is perhaps I would say Bruges la Morte, I would even say it's a novel that develops and explores the concept of resemblance. And speaking, as we were before, of religious ritual, we have this devotion, right? But not a religious devotion. We have devotion for something that is not there anymore. Every morning, just like the day after her death, he made his devotions like the stations of the Via Crucis of love in front of the memories preserved of her. So this is the kind of connection that he has with the dead woman, and that determines or establishes the kind of connection that he will have with the new woman, right, that appears in his life. And finally, another point about the city being an influential character. Look at this. Bruges began to govern Hugues again and to command obedience. She became again a character, the main interlocutor of his life, who impressed, dissuaded, commanded, according to which we orient ourselves, and from which we draw all our reasons for acting. So once again, a few passages from the novel just to give you an idea, and I am sure that the French originals in the screen will be a lot more useful to you than my translations. But just to give you an idea of what the style is like, and also of some of the themes that are present here. Further reading and watching. Let's look at this a little bit. Of course, I would like to read D'entre les morts and also to rewatch Vertigo in the light of what I just read by Rodenbach in Bruges la Morte. Also, I recommend Más allá del olvido, Beyond Oblivion, directed by Hugo del Carril from the year 1956, if you get the chance to watch that. I would say even if you do not understand Spanish, just watch it for the images and the camera work. And if you do read Bruges la Morte, then you don't really need to speak Spanish in order to watch the film. There are many differences between the two, okay? Between Bruges la Morte and Más allá del olvido. For one, the ending is completely different. Another movie that explores a similar idea, this idea of somebody meeting somebody else that looks very much like a former lover, is Ryusuke Hamaguchi's Asako 1 and 2, which I have right here. As you know, Hamaguchi won the Academy Award for Drive My Car, which I still need to see. But nobody really talks a lot about Asako 1 and 2. I thought it was a magnificent film. I highly recommend it, so if you get the chance to watch it, you can compare it to Vertigo in many aspects of the plot. If you want to read a story about a guy who is obsessed with the dead to the point that he cannot focus on the living, there's a classic story by Henry James titled The Altar of the Dead. So I recommend that. It was, of course, the inspiration for what movie by François Truffaut? Yes, my friend, The Green Room. Okay, great film, one of Truffaut's best, I would say, and he directed the movie, of course, but he also starred in it, just as he did in The Wild Child. So I think it's really one of his best films. I would say maybe in the top 5 or something like that. And then finally, I would also recommend to you The Great Gatsby. Okay, about the idea of bringing the past back to life. I still think this is one of the best American novels ever written, and as a personal trivia kind of thing, I believe this was the first novel that I read in English. It was back in Argentina, you know, when I was studying English. They made us read it, and I assumed it was a simplified version or something, but years later I realized it was the actual, original version of the novel. So I guess I can say Gatsby was the first novel that I read in English. Okay, so bottom line, Bruges la Mort is just impressive, is delightful. I devoured it in French. Okay, so that is saying quite a bit because I am a very slow reader. I read this novel in maybe about 24 hours in a different language. Okay, so the story is this. I decided to look at it to get a better idea of the movie, Más allá del olvido, and I was like, okay, let's look at the first pages. And I literally could not put it down. Okay, I kept reading and reading and reading. I suspended my other reading that I was doing and finished this novel. So I think that tells you a little bit about it. You know, I want to read more by Rodenbach, maybe some of the poetry if I can get my hands on it, because I really like his style. And let me tell you this, my experience reading this novel reaffirmed a lesson that I learned many years ago, and it's this. Every now and then, let's pick up a book that nobody else is reading. Okay, there is much to be gained, I think, by doing that. Nobody reads this novel, but I enjoyed it very, very much. I love the classics, as you know. I love the books that most people know, but every now and then I make a point of picking up a book that nobody has heard of, and most of the time I am very happy that I did. So this one, it's highly recommended. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? They are always welcome. I hope you enjoyed this video, my 2 cents on Bruges la Mort by Georges Rodenbach. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.